basically, we have sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. I know you've heard of those phrases. What these three types of memory are, how much can they hold, how long can they hold the stuff, and why do we care about it? Our sensory memory is your senses. Anything that comes in through your senses at any point in the day. Sensory memory takes in an incredible amount of sensory information, capacities, but it only holds it there for a brief moment or two. So it holds a ton of sensory information, half a second or less. Smell is the most closely related sensory memory. It has to do with memory pathway, and the olfactory nerves play a huge role. Research will say our sensory memory can hold stuff for 2 seconds. I've seen others say it's half a second to about 3/4 of a second. Our iconic memory is part of our sensory memory. It's a little bit different than our echoic memory. Our brain determines that the information that it is pertinent, that it will be processed where next? Our short-term memory. So our short-term memory, also known as working memory, the duration is about 30 seconds. It turns out that attention is really, really important when we're getting information from our sensory memory to our short-term. The level of attention is really essential here. Issues of attention or deficits in attention can negatively impact information going from sensory to short-term memory. What part of the brain is really working hard here? Prefrontal cortex. So our long-term memory, in terms of capacity, unlimited. We can put as much stuff in our long-term memory as we want. You may not feel like that when you're studying. It is true that that capacity is unlimited. It is also true that in one sitting you can only learn so much. How about the duration? How long can stuff stay in your long-term memory? Technically forever. Yes, if it's not a victim of what we call decay here. After a while, if you don't access and use those memories, the neural pathways separate. That is now gone out of your mind. Yeah, if you're not using that information, or if a medical condition comes up that impairs memory. So long-term memory, we have what's called declarative and non-declarative. Do you remember graduating from high school? So you're declaring, you have access to all those answers. Different types here. We have our semantic memory and our episodic memory. Our semantic memory is memory for facts, words, word meanings. You may know what the word trepidation means. That's coming out of your semantic memory. If you've never heard the word, can you access it? So if you've heard of it, that means you were exposed to it at some point. If you were able to say trepidation means fear, then you are accessing your long-term memory, more specifically your semantic memory of your long-term memory. Episodic memory is memory for events. Think of like an episode of your favorite TV show. Maybe you remember the day you graduated from high school, and maybe you remember the day you got married. So these are things that we can access and articulate. In order for us to get stuff out of these memory stores, this process had to go well. Non-declarative memory sometimes is called our implicit memory. It's stuff that we know, we just don't remember learning it, but we know it. Do you remember the day you learned how to walk? Still a little bit too early to form such distinct declarative memories, but you know how to walk. That's coming out of your procedural memory. The things that you don't remember learning, but you know how to do it, coming out of your non-declarative memory. It's like there's different brain structures involved in the different types of memory. And the amygdala is very, very strongly involved there. Non-declarative memory is any kind of procedural memory. Motor skills fall under non-declarative memory. Classically conditioned responses fall within non-declarative memory too, by the way. HM had his hippocampus purposely destroyed to stop the seizures. No new memories were forming. That's what they thought. Turns out that is no declarative memories, but there was non-declarative learning. Before his surgery, he had never played tennis a day in his life. He had no idea how to play it. After his surgery, he learned how to play tennis, and he was actually a really, really good tennis player. There was definite learning. His short-term memory seemed unaffected, so he could stay in the moment and have a great conversation with you. If you would leave the room and come back in a few minutes later, he would have no idea who you are. The case of HM taught us that declarative and non-declarative memories are definitely different, and they're processed in different parts of the brain. So anterograde amnesia is what HM had. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to form new memories. Put an alias here. Non-declarative memory is sometimes called implicit memory. Declarative memory is sometimes called explicit memory. Can be used interchangeably. People who have experienced something very, very traumatic event is stored in their implicit memory and not their explicit. So that is the Atkinson Schifrin model. The sensory, short-term, long-term, You can see that attention is needed, proper attention is needed for information you get from sensory to short term. Proper processing is needed for information you get from short term to long term. This takes a whole ton of effort, but there wasn't enough repetition to get it fully in the long-term memory for you. We're going to talk about something called long-term potentiation. Remember I said earlier, when we are exposed to something complicated for the first time, we don't just pick it all up. You listen to that and it's like, oh, that's interesting. And then you go to write something down and you're like, I really don't know what they were saying. That's normal, so don't think there's something wrong. It's basically a process where synapses become more efficient. Something new, we're creating a new neural pathway. The more we revisit that pathway, the stronger that pathway and that synapse becomes. The enhancement of synaptic transmission. Focusing on the new neural pathway that has been created, long-term potentiation talks about the enhancement of that pathway. We are trying to continuously revisit that pathway. So over time with practice, that pathway is triggered easier, and long-term potentiation allows our synapses to become stronger and more effective. Are there any things that we might experience that we don't want that to happen? Traumatic, so really unpleasant, horrifying experiences, we actually don't want this to happen. Whatever we're trying to learn or whatever we experience, oftentimes long-term potentiation, if we continuously revisit that, it's going to happen. So what we know when you're trying to learn something new and complicated, tiring, it takes a lot of effort. But the more you do it, long-term potentiation kicks in and it will become easier and easier over time. The increase in synaptic efficiency can last for hours, days, or weeks even. If you continuously activate this new pathway, over time, only a little bit of activation is getting this going. So it requires less effort over time because a lot of learning has already taken place because long-term potentiation has taken place. The more input you have, the more practice you have, the stronger that synapse will be. If the synapse is kind of energized, if you will, for a whole week, and you put more and more learning in there on that topic for that whole week, you're kind of like in the zone. You're really starting to learn this stuff really well. If you wait and 2 weeks later you start studying that stuff, it loses it. Exactly. So now your synapses aren't as efficient because you missed that little window, which is why, like, the danger of taking a once-a-week class, like, you might be totally here in the moment like, oh, this stuff's so cool. And then you might put your book away, and we have a break next week, and you might open your book 2 weeks later and be like, wait, I actually don't remember any of it. Or record it and listen to it. All right, so you should know now what long-term potentiation is, why we care. You should know the brain structures involved in learning and memory. The one that I know we didn't discuss, it's if you remember what the thalamus does, you would know why indirectly this is a really important component. You also know the Atkinson Schifrin model of memory, transmitters, and hormones here. Glutamate is one of the three. Glutamate is the most excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is essential for learning. So there's one of the three. Dopamine plays a huge role in attention, which is essential for learning. Okay, so dopamine is another one. Acetylcholine, that's the third one. Disease, do some people get, that completely deteriorates their learning and memory system. So when we are learning something new, we're creating new neural pathways, so excitatory transmission has to happen. Okay. So glutamate, dopamine, acetylcholine, those are the major three. We talk about stress and hormones, what one should kind of come to the surface. Cortisol is very interesting when it comes to the process of learning and memory. Too much cortisol can interfere with the process of learning and memory. Some cortisol is very helpful. Too much, though, can interfere with many processes, learning and memory being one of them. So too much cortisol can interfere with coding. So encoding is getting the information in with storage, getting it wherever it needs to be so we can keep it there, and then once we're being able to access it when we need it. If someone's cortisol is so high, it interferes with proper encoding. Could that interfere with the process of learning and memory? If it's not fully encoded, might we have a difficult time remembering it later on? Some cortisol enhances memory formation. Too much cortisol interferes with memory formation. There is also evidence that too much cortisol is potentially toxic to the hippocampus. The answer is retrieval. Suppression is purposeful. It's trying not to remember something. Think about this for a second. The technique out there, a behavioral technique called thought suppression, is terrible. When you try not to think about something, you're actually accidentally thinking about it. So suppression is purposeful. Repression is dopamine and norepinephrine. If too low or too high, that could interfere with memory. So dopamine and norepinephrine. You ever had like an unusually vivid memory of something that was so good and you remember it pretty well? So your levels of dopamine and norepinephrine were adequate. So flashbulb memory is a memory that is unusually vivid and you remember it for a long time. If someone has a flashbulb memory, the idea is their dopamine and norepinephrine was adequate, not too high, not too low, and their cortisol was higher than normal. Especially in your textbook on aging in memory. I think that sometimes our society teaches us that as we get old, we're all going to lose our memories and have dementia. A significant amount of people will, but a significant amount of people won't. So don't think that that is our destiny. So aerobic activity is one of the best things that we can do throughout our life, even into our geriatric years.